Hello and welcome to the programme. The technical mission of the International Monetary Fund has positively assessed the fulfilment of the standby arrangement conditions. This was according to Ukraine's Finance Minister Oksana Markarova. Now, meanwhile, the Ukrainian government has completed more than half of the commitments required by the EU to receive the second tranche of a €500 million financial package. Now, I'm pleased to say, to discuss these international programmes and more, we are joined in the studio today by Vitaliy Kravchuk. He's a senior research fellow at the Institute for Economic Research here in Kyiv. So thank you so much for coming in.
Yeah.
So we have a lot to cover. Firstly,
Yes.
The presidential elections are approaching very fast. So a very quick question really is, how do you think the presidential elections will affect, if anything, the IMF tranches in the future?
Well, it shouldn't, ideally, because most of the conditions that need to be fulfilled are not exactly the province of the president. It's for the government and for the parliament. And they supposedly won't change after the elections. But of course, there could be change in political calculus, I guess, in the parliament. So as long as this, so directly no. But because it is quite possible that it could affect this remaining months of the work of the current parliament, then it can influence.
Now, there was a technical mission, actually, that recently left Ukraine. They were here earlier this month. And some commentators in the Ukrainian media said that when they left, they were very quiet and they weren't sure whether that was a positive sign or a negative sign. So what's your assessment of that? Is that normal that they left without a comment?
I think that's normal, more or less, because I would expect that we will have the official review mission if we have fulfilled the necessary conditions, not earlier than April.
Yeah. And what's the difference, actually, then, between this technical mission and the assessment mission? What are they looking at in particular?
Well, technical mission is looking at the interim progress with the particular benchmarks that were set in the IMF program. And review mission has more authority. It not only has to assess the progress of the current progress, it also has to agree the conditions, the prior conditions, the conditions for the second tranche. So as usual, during every review, the program is updated, revised and updated, and this revision and update, this is the key difference between the technical mission and the official mission.
And what are the particular factors that the missions are looking at when they come to Ukraine? What particular areas are they focusing on?
Well, it's more or less usual. So they first look at the monetary and fiscal policy. So that's more or less the most important areas where, and then they look at the progress of the reforms which were agreed in the IMF program. So if monetary and budget review is more or less by default, where they look for the reforms depends on what was agreed. So, for example, this time it's anti-corruption code. There is also provision about the financial sector reform, which was not so far fulfilled. So they would expect that.
I know there was quite a big scandal again in the Ukrainian media. They were writing about this, about how the Constitutional Court, when you first looked at this new legislation, they said that illegal enrichment, the criminal liability for this had been abolished. I think if you look a bit closer at the text, that's perhaps not quite the case. But do you think that will affect the tranches going forward and also the reforms of the fiscal service, for example?
Well, technically, again, it's not part of, so the anti-enrichment provisions were not part of the current program, but I think it's quite likely that during this updating process, IMF would look at the approval of this updated article in the criminal code about illicit enrichment is quite likely.
And do you think with Ukraine due to pay back quite a few loans this year, how will that affect the Ukrainian hryvnia? because there'll be a lot more demand for dollars, so that will make it weaker. Is that right?
Well, repayment of the IMF loans shouldn't affect hryvnia directly, because IMF loan usually goes to the reserves of the National Bank. Then when there's time to repay the IMF loan, then it's again repaid directly from the international reserves so from the dollar account of the National Bank.
But Ukraine has these reserves? I mean,
Well, Ukraine has enough reserves to pay back most of the obligations, but still Ministry of Finance will have to borrow quite a lot this year and the next year.
And what sort of pressure does that put on Ukraine, the fact that they have to borrow a lot of money in order to pay back, partly pay back these loans?
Well, it means that they pay quite a lot in interest, because, for example, most recent transaction cost almost 10% in interest.
10%?
Almost 10%. It was, I think, $350 million. Well, it's in commercial terms. What we get from the IMF and from the EU is much more cheaper.
Yeah.
That's why it's important to keep it running.
Yeah. And what about the bond price as well? Because I recently read that I think it was the 10-year bond price was quite high. So what does that mean?
Oh, it means that...
in terms of confidence, in terms of the investor confidence?
I guess it means that quite a lot of the political risk was priced in the when it was placed. And so the interest rate was already high in September. So I guess so far there was no meltdown. And I would expect that investors expect that for 10% in interest, it's risk worth it.
Yeah, and while Ukraine and the IMF are negotiating on the second tranche, you have a lot of these international ratings agencies that are still very influential. Is that right? I mean, what sort of factor, if any, do they play in terms of trade with Ukraine, in terms of investor confidence?
Well, in ratings, the key role they play is for pricing of the Ukrainian debt, of Ukrainian sovereign debt. Well, then the Ukrainian sovereign debt impacts the borrowing of the few companies that still borrow on the international markets. It's quite few. It's few, I think, few agricultural companies that still that have access to the international markets. So far, it's limited because it impacts on the borrowing cost of the government and these few companies. But hopefully in the future, when the situation will be more normal, I guess this political risk hopefully will go away. Then it would mean that more companies will aspire to enter the global markets, and for them it's important for Ukraine to have solid rating, because usually any company in the country has no better rating than the government. But in Ukrainian case...
Well, it shouldn't have, at least.
It shouldn't have, but in Ukrainian case, Metinvest, for example, has better debt rating than the government, because it has quite significant dollar income, which, as opposed to the government,
so
which has only in hryvnia.
Okay, well, we have about 1 minute left, so very quickly, in case the IMF tranche, the second tranche, gets delayed, what sort of consequences are there? Can you sum that up, if there are consequences?
Well, the key issue for the IMF program is to continue. That the delay of the tranche for a few months is quite usual, not unexpected, so it will be okay. The key problem would be if there is breakup of the cooperation.
Okay, well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for coming into the studio and explaining that very complicated topic. So, thank you.
Yeah, it's complex.
That was Vitaliy Kravchuk. He's a senior research fellow at the Institute for Economic Research here in Kyiv. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned with UATV.